Sunlight barely touched the forest floor, trees crowded around, their branches a tangled roof overhead. I walked on, boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The woods were silent but for the sounds I made moving through them. I kept to a faint path, barely more than animal trails, hoping it would lead somewhere. It did. The trees shifted and a small space opened up. In the middle, a cabin stood. It looked old and forgotten. The wooden walls were grey and weathered, some boards warped and loose. Windows were covered with planks nailed tight, blocking out any view inside. The door, made of thick wood, was still there, but scarred. Deep lines were etched across its surface, as if something with sharp claws had attacked it for a long time. I went nearer, touching the wood. It felt rough and cold. The cabin was small, just one room, I guessed from its size. Smoke-stained stones formed a chimney that leaned to one side. No smoke came from it now. Everything was still. The silence here was different, deeper than in the woods around. It pressed down. Curiosity pushed me forward. I reached for the door handle. It was metal, rusted, but it turned when I tried it. The door moved inwards with a groan of old wood. Darkness met me in the doorway. I hesitated, then stepped inside. Dust lay everywhere. It coated every surface, muffling sound, making the air still and stale. Shapes of furniture emerged from the gloom. A table, chairs, a bed frame. Cobwebs hung in corners like grey lace. The only light came from the open doorway, weak and failing to reach far into the room. I moved further in, my feet crunching on something under the dust on the floorboards. The air inside smelled old, dry, and something else. Something sharp, almost metallic beneath the dust. I went towards the table. Newspapers were stacked on it, yellowed and brittle. I picked one up carefully. The paper crumbled at the edges. The date was years ago, many years. No one had been here for a very long time. Turning from the table, I noticed something else in the dim light. Dark patches marked the floor in places, near the door and by one wall. I knelt down, brushing dust away with my hand. The dark patches remained. They were stains in the wood, a deep brown-red color. They looked like dried blood. A chill went through me, colder than the cabin air. Blood. Here, in this forgotten place, what had happened here? The scratches on the door, the boarded windows, the blood inside. A story of something bad, something hidden away. I moved away from the stains, a knot tightening in my stomach. I wanted to leave. This place felt wrong, heavy with something unseen. But night was coming. The light outside was already fading. It would be dark soon, properly dark under the trees. The cabin, despite everything, was shelter. Leaving now meant being in the woods after dark. Staying felt bad, but perhaps safer than the unknown darkness outside. I found a chair that looked sturdy enough and cleared some dust off it. Sitting down, I faced the door, watching the rectangle of fading light. The forest sounds outside changed as dusk deepened. Birdsong stopped. A different set of noises began, rustlings in the undergrowth, the calls of night creatures far off. The cabin became darker, the shadows inside growing, filling the corners, stretching across the floor. The last light faded completely. The cabin was black inside, except for the faint lighter grey of the doorway. I could not see the furniture anymore, only shapes in the dark. The woods outside were just sounds now, unseen movements, and then a new sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the other forest noises. A scraping sound like nails on wood, coming from the door. I held still, listening. The scraping came again, louder now, definitely the door. Something was outside, at the door, scratching. My breath caught in my throat, scratching at the door, like the marks already there. But this was new, happening now. The sound continued, becoming more insistent, more frantic. Long scrapes, short scratches, a pattern of disturbance against the old wood. Then the sound changed again. A snapping noise like wood fibers breaking. The scraping stopped, replaced by a splintering, cracking sound. The door frame groaned. Something was pushing, forcing itself against the door with power. The cracking became louder, more violent. Splinters of wood flew inwards as the door began to give way. A section of the door frame ripped apart with a sharp crack. Darkness from outside pushed in through the opening. The splintering sound increased. The door was breaking, being forced open. More cracks, louder snaps. A larger section of the door frame shattered. The door lurched inwards, hanging loose on its hinges. A gap appeared, widening quickly as more wood ripped and tore. The sound was deafening in the small dark cabin. With a final explosive crack, the rest of the door frame gave way. The door swung inwards completely, banging against the inside wall with a boom that echoed in the confined space. The doorway was open, a black rectangle against the slightly less black of the cabin interior. And then, silence. Silence after the noise of destruction. Silence that was somehow more terrifying than the cracking wood had been. Silence and something else filling the doorway. A shape stood there, taller than a person, outlined against the darker woods beyond. Its form was indistinct in the blackness of the doorway, but there was a presence, something solid and real, not moving, just there, filling the space where the door had been. Then it stepped inside. Dust swirled around my boots as I walked toward the village. Flags flapped above wooden stalls laden with vegetables. Music played from a small stage where people danced. It looked like a county fair, yet there was something strange in the atmosphere. Villagers smiled, offered me bread and cheese. Their eyes, though, held a deep stillness. They spoke of the harvest, the best in years, each word coated in a layer of something I couldn't name. Children ran around, their laughter sharp against the strange quiet underneath everything. As dusk began to color the sky, the music stopped. A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone gathered in the village square, faces turned towards a raised platform. An older man in a dark coat stepped forward. He held a wooden bowl filled with small pieces of paper. My stomach tightened. The smiles from earlier were gone, replaced by anticipation and something akin to fear. The man spoke, his voice carrying across the silent square. I could not understand his words, but the tone was solemn, ritualistic. He drew a piece of paper from the bowl. A young woman near the front gasped, then went silent. The man read the name on the paper. Another woman standing beside me swayed slightly. Her hand went to her mouth. The name echoed in the square, a sound that felt cold despite the evening air. Two men stepped forward and gently took the young woman by the arms. She did not resist. Her face was blank, eyes wide but unfocused. They led her away from the crowd, out of the square toward the edge of the village. Confusion pulsed through me. I tried to ask the woman beside me what was happening, but she stared straight ahead as if in a trance. The crowd began to disperse, the festive mood completely vanished. Now there was only a heavy quiet. I followed the two men and the young woman. They walked through the fields that surrounded the village, the tall crops rustling in the growing breeze. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But the colors felt wrong, stained somehow. They reached a field further out, away from the village lights. In the center of the field there was a small mound of freshly turned earth. The men stopped at the mound and laid the young woman down gently upon it. She remained still, eyes fixed on the darkening sky. The two men stepped back away from her. They turned and walked back toward the village, leaving her alone in the field. I watched, frozen, as they disappeared into the distance. The village lights looked very far away now. Only the sounds of the wind and the rustling crops filled the silence around me. The young woman lay motionless on the mound. The sky deepened to a bruised purple, then black. A coldness seeped into the air, colder than the natural night chill. A strange, prickling sensation ran across my skin. I wanted to move, to go to the woman, but something held me rooted to the spot. Then, from the edges of the field, from the deep blackness between the rows of crops, something began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, like a skeleton stretched too far. It moved without sound, like a nightmare taking shape. Its form became clearer as it stepped into the open field. It was gaunt, all sharp angles and bone. Its limbs were elongated, fingers long and spindly. There was no flesh on it, only something pale and hard. It had no face, just a smooth expanse where features should be. It moved toward the mound where the young woman lay. Its long fingers reached out. The wind picked up, whispering through the crops. A sound like dry leaves scraping together. Panic clenched in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and watch. The skeletal figure reached the mound. It stood over the young woman, its form blocking out the faint starlight. Its elongated fingers descended toward her. The air grew colder still, biting at exposed skin. A complete and utter stillness fell. Not even the wind seemed to move. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own pulse in my ears. The skeletal thing was above her now, its fingers just inches from her face. And then everything went black. Not just the night, but everything. A sudden total darkness closed in, swallowing sight and sound. I stumbled back, arms outstretched, trying to find something, anything in the black void. After a moment, or perhaps much longer, the darkness began to recede. My vision returned, blurry at first, then slowly sharpening. The night was still there, the stars faint pinpricks above. The wind was back, sighing through the fields. The skeletal figure was gone. The mound was empty. The young woman was no longer there. Only the disturbed earth and the rustling crops remained in the empty field. The village lights still shone far away, indifferent in the distance, and the heavy quiet had returned, settling over everything once more. I arrived by boat, the grey island looming larger as we got nearer. The previous keeper had gone, vanished, they said, no trace. The island was small, just rock and rough grass, the lighthouse a white tower against the dull sky. The boat left and I was alone. Days passed. Routine took over, checking the lamp, noting the weather, keeping the tower clean. Quiet, very quiet. I started to notice marks inside the lantern room, scratches on the stone walls, high up and low down, as if something had tried to get out, or in. The nights were long. Darkness wrapped around the island. The beam swept around, cutting through the blackness. One night I caught a glimpse, something pale, thin at the edge of the light. Just for a moment, then gone. I put it down to tiredness, the sea playing tricks, but I glimpsed it again the next night, and the night after. Always at the edge of the beam, always watching the tower. A tall, pale shape. It moved with a strange quickness, then stood still, very still, always facing the lighthouse. I began to feel uneasy. The island felt different in the dark. The wind seemed to whisper, the waves to mutter. Alone in the tower with the lamp turning, I felt eyes on me, not just the pale shape, but something else, something I couldn't see. One afternoon, exploring the small living quarters, I found it, tucked under a loose floorboard, a small leather-bound book, a journal, the previous keeper's. I opened it. The writing was cramped, hurried. It started with the weather, the daily tasks, just like my days. Then a change, a subtle shift in tone. He wrote of sleepless nights, of feeling watched, of noises outside in the dark. He mentioned the scratches too. He had seen them. He had tried to explain them away, like me. But his entries grew stranger. He wrote of a figure outside, the same pale shape I had seen. He described its eyes, dark holes he called them, empty and hungry. He wrote of fear growing every night. He stopped going outside after dark. The journal entries became shorter, more frantic. He wrote of isolation, of the silence getting to him. He wrote about the figure. It was always there now, he said, every night, closer each time. He felt it could almost touch the tower. Then came the entry that made my blood run cold. He had learned something. He didn't say how, but he knew. He wrote, "It cannot come in, not unless..." The sentence stopped there. The next entry was days later. The writing was shaky, barely readable. He wrote of desperation. The loneliness, the constant fear had become too much. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He was losing his mind, he wrote. And then he wrote of the figure again. It was still out there, always. The last entry was short, just a few words. "I can't stand it, not anymore, anything to stop it." That was the last thing he wrote. The journal ended there. He vanished soon after. I closed the book. My hands were shaking. I understood then. The scratches were not from something trying to get out, they were from something trying to get in. And the previous keeper, he had let it. He had let it in to escape the loneliness, the fear, anything to stop the torment. I walked to the lantern room, out to the balcony that circled the light. The night was black, no moon. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping the sea, and there it was, at the edge of the light. The pale, thin figure, still watching. It raised a hand, long, pale fingers. It did not wave. It pointed at the lighthouse. Pointed at me. The dark holes of its eyes seemed to burn in the night, hungry, patient. I went back inside, bolted the heavy door, checked every window, every lock. The stone walls felt cold, too thin. The scratches seemed to be everywhere now, not just in the lantern room, but down the stairs, in the living quarters, as if they were spreading. I sat in the small room, the journal in my lap, the lamp turned above, its beams sweeping the darkness. Outside, the pale figure remained, waiting. I knew then what the previous keeper had learned. It cannot come in, not unless... Isolation, desperation. They creep in slowly like the rising tide. They wear you down, bit by bit. They make you do things you wouldn't normally consider. Anything to stop the silence, the fear, the endless nights. I looked at the journal again. Anything to stop it. His last words, a plea or an invitation. The wind howled around the lighthouse, the waves crashed against the rocks below, and outside in the darkness the pale figure waited, still, watching, knowing. The scratches in the walls seemed to deepen in the lamplight. They seemed to move, to lengthen, to reach for me. The silence inside the tower was immense, broken only by the turning lamp and the beating of my own heart. I stared at the bolted door, then at the windows, secured but fragile. Every barrier felt paper-thin, useless against the patient, hungry gaze from outside. The isolation pressed down, a physical thing. The fear tightened its grip. Days turned into nights, nights into days. The routine continued, but it was hollow now. Each task done mechanically, without feeling. My mind was always on the figure outside, always on the scratches in the walls, always on the journal and the last keeper's last words. The pale shape was always there now. Night and day. Even in the faint daylight I could see it, a pale smudge against the grey rocks. It never moved away from the lighthouse. Its gaze was constant, unwavering. The silence grew louder, the isolation deeper, the fear a constant companion. I began to talk to myself, just to hear a voice. It didn't help. The silence always returned, heavier than before. One night I stood at the window looking out at the figure. It was closer now. Just beyond the circle of light, I could see it clearly. The pale skin, the dark eyes, the long fingers. It stood motionless, watching. A thought came to me, a whisper in the silence. The previous keeper's last words echoed in my mind. Anything to stop it. Stop the fear, stop the loneliness, stop the silence. The thought grew stronger, a seed taking root in the barren soil of my mind. What if letting it in was the only way to stop it? To stop the fear, the isolation, the endless watching. The pale figure raised its hand again, pointed at the door, pointed at me. The dark eyes burned in the gloom, an invitation or a promise, or something else entirely. I stared at the door, the heavy bolts, the only barrier between me and the figure outside, between me and the silence, the fear, the endless watching. My hand reached out, towards the bolt. The metal was cold under my fingers. Outside, the figure remained, waiting. The night always arrived the same way. The air grew cold, even in summer. A stillness dropped over our village, silencing the usual sounds of animals and people. We all knew what the stillness meant. The manor house on the hill demanded its due. For generations, our village had lived under the shadow of the noble family. They owned everything, the land, the crops, even, sometimes, the very air we breathed. Their wealth and power were a shield, they said, a shield against hardship. A shield maintained by a price. The price was blood. Once a month, someone from our village was chosen, selected to walk up the hill, through the manor gates, and into the darkness beneath. No one ever returned. We whispered stories, old wives' tales of a creature living beneath the house, a thing of night and hunger. We called it the tax collector. This month it was my brother. His name was drawn. He was barely a man, still with the softness of youth on his face. They came for him at dusk. 2 guards from the manor, faces grim, armor dull in the fading light. He went without a struggle, head bowed, accepting his fate as others had before him. But I could not accept it, not my brother. While the village huddled in their homes, doors bolted, I made my plan. Fear coiled in my stomach, a tight, icy knot. But beneath it, something harder burned, a fierce refusal. Under cover of darkness I moved. The manor loomed against the moonless sky, a dark shape on the hill. The gates, usually imposing, were slightly ajar, a sliver of invitation into the jaws of the beast. I slipped through, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The grounds were silent. No wind stirred the leaves, no birds called. Only the crunch of gravel under my worn shoes broke the silence. The manor house itself was vast and cold, stone walls rising into the darkness. No lights showed in the windows. It appeared deserted, yet I knew it was not. Something watched from within. I found a side door, unlocked as if expected. Inside, the air shifted. It became colder, drier. The smell was different too, old dust and something else, something metallic and sharp. I moved into a hallway, vast and echoing. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, reaching up to a ceiling lost in shadows. Portraits lined the walls, faces pale and stern, eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. The noble family, generations of them staring down from their painted canvases. At the end of the hall, a set of steps led down into the earth. This must be the way. Each step I took downwards was a step deeper into dread. The air grew colder still. The metallic scent intensified, joined by a damp, earthy smell. The silence became absolute, pressing in on my ears. The steps ended in a narrow passage. Rough stone walls closed in around me, damp and slick to the touch. Water trickled somewhere nearby, the sound echoing in the confined space. The passage twisted and turned, descending deeper and deeper. I moved forward, driven by a desperate hope and a mounting terror. The passage opened into a chamber. Vast and circular, it felt like the belly of the world. Stone walls disappeared into the darkness above, the ceiling unseen. In the center of the chamber, a raised dais, and on the dais, a figure. I could not make out details at distance. It was still, draped in what appeared to be rich, dark fabric. As I moved a step, then another into the chamber, the figure resolved itself. Not a creature, a man, or what had been a man. He sat upon a throne-like chair carved from dark stone, eyes closed, face pale and gaunt. He was dressed in finery, velvet and lace, but the clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed too thin, too fragile. This was no monster, this was a lord. But something was terribly, terribly wrong. The air around him vibrated with an unseen energy, a stillness that was not peace but something else, something ancient and cold. I moved towards the dais, drawn by a morbid curiosity, a need to understand. As I drew nearer, I noticed details I had missed. The skin was not just pale, it was almost translucent, veins visible beneath the surface, like blue rivers on a map. The hands resting on the arms of the throne were skeletal, fingers long and thin, nails like yellowed ivory. Then the eyes opened, not human eyes. These were red, deep, burning red, like embers in a dying fire. They fixed on me, and a jolt of pure primal fear ripped through me. This was not a man, not anymore. Recognition flickered in those red depths. A flicker of something old, something weary, something infinitely cruel. A smile stretched across the thin lips, a terrible, bloodless smile that revealed teeth too long, too sharp. I understood then. The stories were not just tales, they were truth. The tax collector was not some beast lurking beneath the manor. The tax collector was the master of the manor himself, the head of the noble family, still ruling centuries after he should have been dust. He raised a hand, the skeletal fingers beckoning me, inviting me closer. I could not move. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of those ancient, burning eyes. I had come to save my brother, but now I understood. There was no saving him. There was no escape from this place. There was only the tax. And it was still due. The red eyes held mine. A sound, low and rasping, came from the figure on the throne. Not words, something older than words, something that resonated in the bones, a promise of endless night, of unending hunger. I was not afraid for my brother anymore. I was afraid for myself, for the village, for everything. The tax was due, and it would be paid again and again. The bodies arrived day after day, each one carrying a secret I began to notice. It started subtly, a minor detail catching my eye as I prepared them. Tiny marks like pinpricks hidden under clothing, easily missed, but I saw them again and again. It became a pattern, a grim similarity linking these silent forms on my table. It wasn't just the marks, it was something else, an emptiness. They felt lighter than they should, almost hollow. Examining closer, I realized. Blood. They lacked blood, drained, not in the way of accidents or illness, but deliberately taken. It made no sense. Who would do this, and why? The question spun in my mind, a dark puzzle I couldn't solve. I worked in the peace of the funeral home, surrounded by stillness, yet a turmoil grew inside me. Each body added to the unsettling picture, each tiny puncture wound, deepening my worry. Then last night the van came, another delivery. The usual paperwork was vague, details thin. "Found at home?" was all it said. The man, middle-aged. I wheeled him into the preparation room, the familiar chill of the space doing little to calm the ice forming in my veins. He seemed ordinary enough at a glance, clothes neat, face calm, but underneath I knew what to expect. I began to undress him with careful hands, my heart beat a little faster than usual. And there they were, tiny holes almost invisible against his skin, clustered near his neck, hidden by his collar. The bloodlessness was pronounced. He was shockingly pale, even for someone deceased. A strange dryness to his skin, too. I moved to begin the usual procedures, trying to push down the rising sense of dread. I started with his face, gently cleansing it, preparing it. As I worked, I noticed his mouth. It was slightly open, relaxed. I positioned it to close naturally. That's when it happened. His eyes snapped open, not a gentle opening, not a slow return to awareness. Sudden sharp flick, wide, staring directly up at me. My breath hitched. I froze, hands still on his face. His eyes were clear, focused, but devoid of life. They were open, but empty, like windows into a void. And then his lips moved. They didn't speak, didn't form words. They curled, upwards, into a smile. A wide, unnatural curve that stretched across his face, pulling at the corners of his eyes, which remained blank, unseeing. The smile was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. It was a mockery of happiness, a grotesque display on a lifeless face. It was a smile that promised pain, that hinted at something terrible just beneath the surface. A shiver ripped through me, cold and sharp. I stumbled back away from the table, heart hammering against my ribs. My eyes stayed locked on the smiling corpse. At that moment, the lights flickered, once, twice, then settled back, a little dimmer than before, buzzing slightly, and then I could hear it. A noise from the next room where the coffin stood, waiting. A soft sound like wood scraping against wood. A shift, then another from a different coffin. A muffled thud, then a scratch. The sounds were quiet, subtle, but impossible to ignore in the silence of the funeral home. They were moving. The bodies in their coffins, they were shifting. My blood ran cold. Reality seemed to twist, the familiar room becoming alien, threatening, the smiling man on the table, the flickering lights, the noises from the coffins. It all combined into something deeply, fundamentally disturbing. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. The smile on the corpse face seemed to widen, or perhaps it was just my imagination, my fear playing tricks in the dimming light. The sounds from the coffin room grew slightly, subtle rustles and creaks, like something waking from a long sleep and stretching stiff limbs. The air in the room grew colder, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a different kind of cold, a cold that seeped into your bones, that spoke of something ancient and malevolent. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to escape this place of waking dead. But my feet remained fixed to the floor, my body locked in place by a terror so complete it was almost paralysis. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging the room into near darkness for a moment before stuttering back on, weaker still. The buzzing grew louder, a frantic electrical whine that filled the silence between the sounds from the coffins. I could hear them more clearly now, not just shifts and scrapes, but bumps, muffled impacts against the wood of the coffins, as if something inside was trying to get out. The smiling man's head tilted just a fraction, as if listening too. His empty eyes seemed to fix on the door that led to the coffin room. The smile remained, fixed and horrifying. The noises intensified, a series of louder thuds, then a splintering sound, like wood cracking under pressure, and then, from beyond the door, a drawn-out rasping sound, like nails scraping on wood, growing louder, coming nearer. The door to the coffin room was old, heavy oak. It remained shut, but I could see the handle turning slowly, deliberately. The rasping sound was right outside the door now, accompanied by softer scratching. It sounded like fingernails, long fingernails dragging across the wood. The smile on the corpse's face seemed to deepen once more, reaching his empty eyes now, reflecting in their black depths. The door handle completed its turn. The latch clicked open and the door began to open, ever so gently, inch by inch. Darkness seeped into the room from the open doorway, swallowing the dim light pressing in. The rasping, scratching sound stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the frantic buzzing of the failing lights, and then a soft, almost whisper from the open doorway, a sound I couldn't quite place, a sound that made my blood freeze solid, a sigh, a long drawn-out sigh like relief, or perhaps contentment. The darkness beyond the door seemed to deepen, to solidify, and in the silence I remained, frozen, staring at the smiling corpse, listening to the sigh from the doorway, waiting for what would come next, and knowing with a chilling certainty that whatever it was already inside. The old film smelled of vinegar and dust as I threaded it onto the projector. Light spilled across the cracked celluloid, bringing to life a world from ages ago. It was a simple scene. A street set, actors in costumes of some period drama moving through their actions. My job was to clean and repair, to bring back the images trapped in the brittle strips. As the reel spun, I noticed a figure at the edge of the set near a painted backdrop of buildings. A man, dressed in dark clothes that set him apart from the bright costumes of the actors. He stood still, slightly back from the activity, watching. His face was mostly hidden in the dimness, a featureless shape observing the scene unfold. He was just there. I continued my work, spooling the film forward to find damage. When I returned to the scene, the man was still there. Same position, same stillness. The actors on the set moved, gestured, reacted to each other, oblivious to the silent watcher in the wings. He remained separate, an observer of a world he wasn't part of, or perhaps a part of in a way unseen by its players. Later, in another scene from the same reel, a similar figure appeared. This time it was during a garden party setting. The actors in bright dresses and suits milled about, holding glasses, gesturing in exaggerated ways typical of silent film acting. And again, at the periphery, the dark-clad man, standing under a fake tree, a permanent fixture in the constructed reality of the film set. He watched. Something started to feel different, not quite right. I rewound the film, going back and forth between the street scene and the garden. The actors in the street scene looked tired. Lines around their eyes seemed deeper. Their smiles, once bright, now appeared strained. In the garden scene it was worse. The vibrant colours of their costumes seemed faded against their faces, which now bore a haggard look. They seemed weary, depleted, their movements less energetic. But the man in the background, he was the same, exactly the same. In both scenes, in every scene I began to locate him in, he was unchanged. His dark clothes, his shadowed face, his posture of detached observation, consistent, while the people in the foreground, the supposed focus of the film, were shifting, subtly but undeniably shifting towards something older, something worn. I started to run the footage again, focusing only on the actors. In the street scene, a young woman in a flapper dress laughed brightly. Moments later, in the garden scene shot, seemingly on the same day, judging by the film stock and the sunlight, this same woman appeared different. The youthful glow was diminished. The brightness in her laugh seemed to have faded. Her movements were less sprightly, less alive. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't looking directly, intently, but it was there, like watching fruit ripen and then decay in fast motion. The actors were moving through the narrative of their film roles, but something else was happening to them within the film itself. They were aging, rapidly, visibly, frame by frame as the reel progressed. I ran more of the film, scene after scene unfolded, a ballroom, a drawing room, a park. Each new setting brought the same disquieting element. The actors, initially full of life, grew steadily more gaunt. Their expressions became vacant, their movements stiff, almost puppet-like. Life seemed to drain from them as I watched. And in the corner of every frame, sometimes more hidden, sometimes more in view, but always at the edge, the man, unwavering. A constant point of stillness, while everything else around him withered within the captured light. His dark shape remained sharp and defined against the fading vitality of the film. The reel was nearing its end. The final scene started. A bare room. The actors, or what was left of them, stood listlessly. They barely moved, their eyes dull, their faces like masks of exhaustion. They looked empty, their costumes hung loose on their frames. The vibrancy of the initial scenes was completely gone, replaced by a palpable sense of depletion. Then the man, he stepped forward. For the entire film he had remained in the background, a silent observer. Now he moved. He walked slowly into the center of the frame, towards the actors. They didn't react. They didn't even seem to notice him as he approached. They were like figures already fading into nothingness. He stopped in front of the camera, closer than he had ever been before. Now his face was clearer. It wasn't shadowed anymore. I could see his features, sharp, angular, cold. His eyes were dark, intense, fixed directly on the lens, on me. He looked directly out of the film across the decades into the small room where I sat, bathed in the projector's light. For a moment he just stared. Then the corners of his lips moved, just a fraction, barely there, but enough. A smile, a faint, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. The film stopped, the reel ended. White light flooded the screen, the projector whirred to a halt, and just as the silence returned to the room, I became aware of a sound from behind me. Stepping onto the soil felt different. Not in a good way. A coldness seeped up from the ground, even through my boots. I'd come to stay with my aunt in the countryside, a place called Hollow Creek. She'd always spoken of it as peaceful, quiet. It did not feel quiet now. The village itself was small, a cluster of stone houses around a green. Everything looked old, worn. The air was still, unnaturally so. No birds sang. No wind rustled the leaves on the trees. An odd stillness hung over everything, pressing down. My aunt's house was on the edge of the village, overlooking fields that stretched out towards dark woods. She greeted me with a strained smile. Her eyes looked tired, aged. She showed me to my room, her movements quick, almost jerky. The room was small, with a single window facing the fields. I unpacked, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me since I arrived. Something was not right here. I couldn't place it, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing moment. Later that evening, my aunt made dinner. We ate in silence. She seemed distant, preoccupied. I tried to make conversation, asking about the village, the people. Her answers were short, evasive. She changed the subject quickly every time. As darkness fell, the feeling intensified, a prickling sensation on my skin, a tightening in my chest. I looked out of the window at the fields. The woods beyond loomed darker now, solid black against the fading light. Something moved out there, at the edge of the trees, too fast to be an animal. A flicker of darkness against the deeper darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to sleep, but rest evaded me. The stillness of the house felt oppressive. Every creak of the old building echoed loudly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. A sound came from outside. Distant, faint, a rustle, a snap of a twig, then silence again. Night after night, the feeling worsened. I began to see things, glimpses at the edge of my vision, shapes in the darkness. Once I thought I glimpsed something pale, fleeting in the field behind the house. Tall, thin, gone in an instant. The village itself seemed to shrink in on itself as days passed. The few people I passed in the street avoided eye contact. Their faces were drawn, worried. A collective tension hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. One morning I woke to commotion, muted voices outside. I looked out of the window. People were gathered in the field near the woods, forms bent over something on the ground, a shape covered by a blanket, whispers carried on the breeze. Someone had been found in the fields. The next day, it happened again. Another gathering in a different field, another shrouded shape. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Fear began to seep into the village, replacing the strange tension with something colder, more acute. My aunt became even more withdrawn, her silences longer, heavier. She refused to speak of what was happening in the fields. If I mentioned it, she would wave a hand dismissively, mutter something about animals, and change the topic again. But it wasn't animals. Everyone knew it wasn't animals. The shapes in the fields were too still, too human. The fear in the air was too real. More bodies were found in the following days. Each discovery brought a fresh wave of horror to the village. People stopped going out after dark. Windows were shuttered early. The silence of night became absolute, broken only by the distant barking of dogs far away. One evening, I found my aunt staring out at the fields, her face etched with despair. For a moment, her usual mask slipped. I almost saw something in her eyes, something akin to terror. Then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by that strained, tired look. I decided to explore myself. I couldn't bear the silence, the secrets any longer. Late one afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, I walked towards the woods. The air grew colder as I approached. A sense of dread settled over me, much stronger than anything I'd experienced before. I reached the edge of the trees. The woods were dense, dark even in the fading light. An unnatural stillness pervaded the trees. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just an absolute suffocating quiet. I stepped inside. The darkness deepened instantly. Shadows stretched out like grasping fingers. The air was damp, cold, and carried a faint metallic scent. I walked deeper, pushing through branches, my heart pounding. I came to a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone structure, ruined, overgrown with moss and ivy, but undeniably there. It looked like an altar or a tomb. An ancient energy pulsed from the stones, cold and potent. As I stood there, a sound reached me, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps moving through the woods, coming closer. I froze, every muscle tense. The footsteps grew louder, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. Something was moving towards me. I turned, trying to see through the gloom. A shape emerged from the darkness. Tall, pale, it moved with a fluid grace, swift and silent. Its eyes caught the last of the dying light. and they burned with an unnatural red glow. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure glided towards me, its form becoming clearer, closer and closer still. I could see the outline of its face, sharp and angular, inhumanly beautiful and terrifying all at once. It stopped just a few feet away, its red eyes fixed on me. A sense of utter cold enveloped me, chilling me to the core. For a moment we stood like that, locked in a silent, terrifying confrontation. Then it turned its head, looking beyond me, towards the village. A low sound escaped its lips, a sound without words, a sound of hunger, of intent, and then it was gone. It moved back into the darkness of the woods, vanishing as silently and swiftly as it had appeared. I stood there, shaking for a long time. The coldness remained, clinging to me. The woods were silent once more, but now the silence felt different, charged, waiting. I turned and ran back through the trees, back to the village, back to the house. I burst inside, breathless, QLBM tend did. My aunt was in the living room, sitting in the dim light. I wanted to speak, to tell her what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was too deep, too raw. I just stood there, gasping for breath, my eyes wide with terror. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't need to. She knew. She had always known. Another scream pierced the night from the direction of the village, cutting through the silence. It was followed by another and another. The screams echoed in the darkness, chilling and desperate. They went on and on and on. Sun beat down harsh, air still. We followed the trail. Dry earth cracked beneath boots. Days we'd been out, following sign. Something big, something bad. Animals gone, just husks left. Empty skins. Blood drained clean. We found deer, fox, even a badger. All same. Lifeless, like balloons popped. No blood left inside, just dry fur and bone. We were trackers. Knew the woods, knew animals. This was different. No animal did this. No beast we knew. This was something else, something hungry. We moved on into deeper woods. Trees got taller, sun less bright, air cooler here. The trail was clearer now, big prints in the dirt, not bear, not wolf, too big, too strange. We stayed quiet. Each step careful, guns ready. We were 5 men, good men, hunters all our lives, but something in the air today, something cold. We came to rocks, big grey cliffs. The trail led up, into the rocks. We climbed, scrambling over stone. The air grew colder still. The prints went on, into a gap in the cliff face. A cave mouth, dark inside the cave. We stopped at the opening, listened, nothing, just still air, too still. One man held a lamp up. Light pushed back some dark as enough to see inside. The cave went back, away from the light. Stone walls, rough and sharp, floor uneven. We moved in, lamplight bounced, making shapes on walls. Strange shapes, deeper in. Air colder, smell in the air, faint like old metal, like dried blood. We walked on, slowly, guns up, ready for anything. Then we saw them. More bodies, animal ones, same as before, empty, scattered on the cave floor, like toys thrown down, all dry, lifeless. Something was here. Close, I could feel it, prickle on my skin, hair on my neck stood up. We moved closer into the cave's heart. The cave opened out, larger space here, walls went back further, darkness at the edges. We held lamps higher, trying to see all around, and then we did, in the far corner. Something moved, in the dark. Shape was tall, too tall, taller than any man, taller than any beast. It stepped out of the dark, into the lamplight, man shape, but not man, skin grey, like stone, eyes black, deep black, no whites, just black holes, mouth open, teeth showed, but not normal teeth, long and pointed, stained red, blood red, dripping. It smiled, but not a smile of joy, a smile of hunger. It moved, fast, so fast, faster than blink, faster than thought. One man screamed, just once, then fell on the floor, like a puppet cut loose. The grey thing moved again, another man gone, just a blur, then another scream, then nothing, just the lamplight shaking, and the grey shape moving in the dark. I raised my gun, fired. Noise loud in the cave, but nothing. The grey thing did not stop, did not even look, just moved. Killing, fast. Another man fell, then another. Now just me, alone, gun empty. I backed away into the dark cave, away from the light, away from the grey thing. It turned to me. Those black eyes fixed on me. It moved towards me. I ran back the way we came, out of the big cave space, into the tunnel, towards the cave mouth. I ran as fast as legs could go, stumbling over stones, tripping in the dark, the sound behind me. Footsteps, not running steps, but coming steps. Getting closer, always closer. I burst out of the cave mouth, into the air, into the night. Moon in the sky, pale and weak, trees all around, black shapes in the dark. I ran through the trees, away from the rocks, away from the cave, ran and ran, did not stop, did not look back, just ran. Heart banging hard, breath burning in chest, branches whipped at face, thorns tore at clothes, ground uneven, twisted roots underfoot, fell once, got up quick, ran on, must get away, must escape, ran until legs burned, until lungs hurt, still ran, kept running, through the woods, through the dark, trying to put space between me and the cave, and the thing in it. Dawn came, sky got lighter, darkness went away, trees turned green again, ground became clear, sun rose in the sky, golden light spread through the woods. I stopped. Could not run more, leaned against a tree, gasping for air, looked back. No sound, nothing coming, maybe safe, maybe escaped. Looked up then, at the tree above me, big tree, thick branches, and something in the branches, shape there, dark shape against the morning sky, grey skin, black eyes, blood teeth, smiling, looking down at me from the tree, waiting, just waiting, for the sun to go, for night to come back, and then... Reports came in about odd sounds deep beneath the city. They came to my station supervisor, and then they came to me. It was my job to check these things. No one else wanted to go down there. The old tunnel had been closed for years. Everyone knew that. But the sounds persisted. People working late at night in the nearby office blocks mentioned them. A low moan, a scrape. I got my torch and went to the access point. The heavy steel door was bolted shut, as it should be. Dust lay thick on the floor around it. I unlocked the bolts, pulled the door open. Cold air rushed out, smelling of damp earth and something else, something stale. I stepped inside. The stairs went straight down, spiraling into darkness. My torch beam cut a small path through the gloom. The concrete walls were clammy. Water trickled down in places. Each step echoed in the silence, a hollow, lonely sound. Deeper I went, the air grew colder, the smell stronger. It was a smell of decay, of something old and forgotten. The stairs ended at a narrow passage. I moved forward, my boots crunching on loose stones. The tunnel walls were closer here, the ceiling lower. It felt like the earth was pressing in. Around a bend, the tunnel widened. I reached an open space. A long stretch of track vanished into blackness ahead. Old rails gleamed faintly in my torchlight, rusty and unused. Wooden sleepers were rotting into the ground. This was the abandoned line. Further along, I could make out shapes in the darkness. The outlines of old railway carriages sat on the tracks. They were tilted, covered in grime, their windows long gone. I walked towards them, my torch beam jumping from one carriage to the next. The first carriage was open, the doors hanging off their hinges. Inside, seats were ripped, metal buckled, everything coated in dust and rust. It was empty. I moved to the next one. This carriage door was jammed shut. I pushed. It scraped open with a screech of metal. Inside it was darker. My torch beam danced across the interior. And then I saw it. On the floor, scattered among the debris, were bones. Small bones. Human bones. Terror jumped into my chest, cold and sharp. I backed out of the carriage, heart pounding. Bones in an abandoned subway carriage. It made no sense, but they were there. I turned to look at the next carriage, and the next. Each carriage was the same. Doors hanging open or jammed shut, inside the same. Bones and clothing, rags of fabric, torn and faded, scattered amongst the bones. It was like some terrible scene frozen in time. People had been brought here, dragged in and left. My breath came fast, shallow. I had to get out. This was not right. This was very, very bad. But something made me go further, a morbid dread, a terrible fascination. I wanted to see the end of the tunnel. I had to know what was down there. I moved deeper into the tunnel, past more carriages, each one filled with the same horror. Bones and rags. The air was thick with the smell now, the smell of rot and something else, something metallic, something like blood. The tunnel began to slope downwards. Water dripped from the ceiling. Louder now. The walls narrowed again, closing in on me. It felt like the earth itself was trying to crush me. Then the tunnel opened out once more. I was in a larger chamber. At the far end, something moved. A shape against the wall. My torch beam jumped to it. It was a figure. Tall and gaunt, hunched over, pressed against the damp stone. It was still, too still. It looked like it was eating. I started to back away. Step by step I retreated. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had to get away. This was a monster. This was something ancient and evil. The figure lifted its head. It turned towards me. My torch beam caught its face, or what should have been its face. Where eyes should have been, There were only black pits, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light. Its mouth was smeared, wet and red. Something dripped from its chin. It knew I was there, it had seen me, and then behind me from the darkness of the tunnel I had just come through, a rustling, a stirring, more sounds, many more sounds waking up.